Hello, and thank you so much for allowing me to be here with you today to talk with you a little bit about the subject of linguistic bias. As many of you know, this is our first series in a segment of 5 series that we're going to be covering throughout this school year so that we can be more culturally responsive educators as we lead in the district work with our students throughout the course of the school year. My name is Jackie Morrissey, and I am a veteran educator for nearly 30 years now. I have been working with teachers and students and district leaders very much like yourself, and seeking to know more and learn more around not just how to perfect my craft as an educator, but also how to do it through the lens of being a culturally responsive teacher and also leader. I am a doctoral student, as you can see, at Liberty University, and I am a wife, a mom, and most importantly, I think for all, I am a lifelong learner, interested in making a difference in the lives of children. I think that's why I was born. I think that's why I was here, and that's what I intend to do until the day that I die. So, as we begin to get into this segment today for this topic of culturally responsive teaching, we're going to be centered around, again, linguistic bias for this first section. And as you see, there are two objectives that we have on the screen in front of us. The first objective says that we are going to gain a deeper understanding of linguistic bias and the negative impact that it has on student achievement. We're going to be looking at solidifying a solid definition for linguistic bias, and we're also going to be looking at some of those things that we need to try to make sure that we stay away from as teachers whenever we're working with students. The second thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to identify those key ways that we can use or we can engage in our delivery of our educational pedagogy to eliminate or diminish the levels of bias that we showcase in our classroom with our students. So we're going to be looking at some of those discriminatory and biased practices that we all might have. So we're going to be taking a very transparent, vulnerable look at ourselves so that we can create more culturally responsive classrooms for our students here in the school district. I want you to take a look at the quote on the screen in front of you. And as I give voice to it, I just want you to just think about the words or phrases or things that might resonate most to you. I think most of us in here are very familiar with the late, great Nelson Mandela. And I love this quote because he once said, if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. However, if you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. Honestly and truly, that speaks volumes about what we're going to be talking about here today. Understanding the power of language and how intimately we are all tied to the languages that we speak, because our language and our identity are so intertwined. And so is that the key or the case for all of our students as well. We can never forget how intricately linked our students are with their language and why it's so important for us to be able to tap into and understand the different nuances and the ways that different languages work with our students. So let's talk about how we can better understand what it means to engage in acts of linguistic bias. So, what is linguistic bias? I'm so glad you asked that question. Linguistic bias, according to Drozdowicz and Paled, is a broad range of practices and actions and also experiences that share a common core of an unfair treatment of a person on the basis of their language. So, if you're looking at that definition, I think the one thing that we do need to hone in on here is that it's unfair treatment of a person on the basis of language. So, if you just could just narrow down on that, we're treating someone unfair because of the language that they speak. They're not getting the same quality and level of treatment, fairness that other students, if you will, in our classrooms receive. I don't think any of us ever set out to be biased, but there are different things that we can do, friends, that can really showcase bias and discrimination towards our students. We're going to be talking about some of those things today. I also want to take a moment to share with you this category or this model that you see on the screen in front of you. It's called Social Categories and Stereotypes of Communication Model. Now, this was created or released by researchers Bukaboom and Burgers in 2019. It was Camille Bukaboom and I think Christian Burgess. So they did a study, and this is one of the frameworks that they came up with. The one thing that I want you to notice as you're looking at this framework are the two areas, the two primary categories of bias that Bukaboom and Burgess named. They said that our biases are often tied to labels. So, how is it that we actually label particular groups of students in our classrooms? And then they also said that our bias is also related to behaviors or characteristics that we instill or we think belong to certain groups of people because of those labels that we put on them. And so, if you're looking at this model, what I think is really interesting about this is that the model seems to, each segment or each category of the model seems to feed the other. And notice over here on this outside left edge, it says that these two inner workings or these two inner categories are also feeding into different situations that our students or we find ourselves in when we're working with particular students. Now, sometimes these behaviors are, as we're going to talk about on our next slide, upcoming, is that sometimes these behaviors are very intentional. Sometimes because of these preconceived notions that we have about certain groups of students or certain groups of people, then we automatically think that they're not going to show up for things because they don't care. Whenever maybe it might be that the parents are always working, or maybe it is that in their culture or in their customs that they don't necessarily show up in places like that. We cannot assume that people don't want to be there for their children, because the better assumption to make, according to Paul Gorski, is that all of us do, all parents do want to show up with their children. But in educational settings, we all have to make sure that we are making the learning environment conducive or inviting enough to include in the cultures and also the languages that are being spoken by other people. We have to learn how to celebrate and include other languages and not just glorify the English language, even though that's the language that we're speaking here. But we cannot make it seem as if this is the supreme, sovereign, most dominant language, and that it's more important than the language that the students that we have in our classrooms that they're speaking at home. So take a look at this. Now, these might be some troubling statistics or facts that might be popping up, and they were very troubling to me whenever I started looking at them as well. Now, according to research, non-native English speakers are often perceived as being what? Less credible. So that means that if somebody, students, parents, whoever, come to us and they are non-native English speakers, then the things that they say to us or the things that they say in certain settings is not necessarily always deemed to be true or right. Another fact that comes out of research is that people with foreign accents are typically deemed less competent and less credible. Now, I think many of us, even here in America, and we speak English, whether we're from the West or from the North, South, or the East, it doesn't matter. But you know that if there is somebody who goes, let's say somebody from the South, they move up north and there is a particular accent that goes along with them. Sometimes people from the South have been perceived to be less intelligent or less credible or less competent or less knowledgeable because they have a foreign accent that is not typical or traditional to the ways in which the people in that particular area speak. Another factor that has come out of a great body of research is that prejudice and bias often occur against people with English speaking deficits. Now, I think many of us have seen or realized throughout the course of our studies and years that this is definitely true. A lot of times, whenever we have students in our classrooms that speak a different language, whether it is Spanish, whether it is French, whatever Haitian, whatever the languages that our students are speaking, sometimes it appears that there are teachers and there are educators and leaders who show prejudices and bias against these particular students because they are not native speakers. And sometimes those biases come out in less opportunities that are granted or given to these particular students. Maybe they don't have the opportunities to go on various outings, or maybe they don't have the opportunities to explore complex texts because they need scaffolds to support them with the language. And so to speak, like whenever this is happening, we're watering down the curriculum for our students. Those folks are acts of prejudice and bias. Another factor that has come out of the research is that accent bias has been extensively studied and it's been extensively well documented. So just like the example that I gave you before about people that come from the South, even here in America, and they move up north, or even people from the North that move down south, or the West Coast or the East Coast, there's so many different stereotypical thoughts and ways of thinking that go along with people that have different accents, that, there's such a great body of research that supports that prejudices and biases really do exist. And I would like to add that if these biases and prejudices are here and they're prevalent for people who are native born Americans, what in the world are we doing with people that are born from other states? So let's kind of think about that as we dive a little bit deeper into understanding this element of linguistic bias. So I told you that we wanted to narrow around on an understanding of what linguistic bias is. Now, I want to share a couple of clips with you. This first clip, both of these clips actually are by a young lady named Camille Bird O'Quinn. And O'Quinn really, she works as a speech pathologist, but she has done extensive studies around the students that have been sent or referred to her for learning deficits. And I don't want to give it all away, but I want you to kind of pay attention to the questions that you see on the screen in front of you as you're listening to what O'Quinn has to say. Think about, how does bias influence behaviors? And I want you to look particularly at the lens of the teachers or the leaders. How do our biases, how do our biases inform the way that we behave with our students? What impact can teacher actions have on student outcomes? So how are our behaviors with our students impacting the trajectory of the lives of our students? And then last but certainly not least, how can we work to change this narrative? So if there's something that we're not doing right, something that is not advantageous or beneficial for our students, what can we do to change that? So let's take a look at the clip and listen to the things that O'Quinn has encountered throughout her work as a speech pathologist.
American Vernacular English, or AVE, as I like to call it, for the acronym AAVE. So help me make that stick. AVE, I like to call it. When we look at AVE, though, do we really use that, or we talk about that as a strength, or do we talk about that as a deficit? Arguably, AVE is the most researched dialect in America, and yet it still is the least respected. This is my daughter, Sophia. I love this picture of her. She looks like she's running for office. She's in 3rd grade here in this picture. And she had some experiences with this in her classroom. As many teachers do, many educators do, they'll put these sentences on the board and say, fix these sentences. These sentences are wrong. Can you make them correct? So she had these sentences on her paper, and one of them said, Mrs. Johnson be organizing the fall festival. Well, Sophia, being my daughter and knowing all about AVE, quickly crossed that out and wrote AVE in the margin, raised her hand for the teacher, and said, excuse me, there's nothing wrong with this sentence. This sentence is written in AVE, and my mama said, this is important to Black people and Black culture, and this is how we talk, and I think you might be racist. That's what she said. Now, at the exact same time, interestingly enough, I was working as a speech language pathologist in an urban education setting. And I was starting to have some of these same experiences where educators were referring students to me, Black students who spoke AVE. And they kept asking me, can you please evaluate this child? He doesn't speak right. He needs to talk better. You need to fix this. He's now not writing right. You need to fix him. And so I said, no, this is a dialectal difference. And as a speech language pathologist, I don't work on dialectal differences, only disorder. This is not a disorder. The educators kept insisting, of course, that it was. And I started to do some research on this because it became really fascinating to me. And I learned that Black students in America are 2.5 times more likely to receive special education services, mostly for learning disabilities or speech language services or behavioral disorder. 2.5 more times more likely than white students to receive special education services. I was concerned by this. So instead of calling these children disordered, I started educating the staff. And I started educating families and students, if they were old enough, about dialectal difference as it compares to mainstream American English. Because mainstream American English is what the school system deems as correct or normal, even if someone else.
All right, so I I want to stop that quote. I mean, I want to stop that segment right there because I think that O'Quinn gave us some very valuable fodder to think about. So she is talking about Ave, African American Vernacular English. And I don't know how many of you have ever thought about that, or even how many of you even knew that Ave was such a thing, but it is. And I think what is so alarming, and one of the things that O'Quinn had to say, is that African American students are often 2.5 more times more likely to be referred for special ed services. And sometimes those referrals are due to their linguistic or their language background. And is that correct or is that incorrect? Based upon the standard of speech or the language patterns that are true or native to their native tongue. So that is something that I want to kind of push the dial on right here. And I also want to go into this next clip where we hear from O'Quinn and she talks about how we can address this. So let's take a look at this next clip from O'Quinn, The Impact of Linguistic Bias in Education, Part 2. This is the clip.
In education, find out what language, what dialect your students are speaking and find value in that as well. You remember my daughter Sophia, who experienced Ave as being deemed as wrong in her classroom, and she had strong words about that. What you don't know, though, is that that teacher called me. She called me from work. She called me at work while I was at work and she was still at work to tell me what had just happened. And she said the whole class got an education on Ave and its cultural significance from my daughter. The teacher said she took pause and thought, I've never thought of it that way. I've never thought of Ave as anything else other than wrong. Now, mind you, this teacher happens to be Black, like me. So she was very excited to consider this isn't wrong. It's just a dialectal difference. And she went to her library there at the school, grabbed some books that were written in Ave, and she read them for the students to exemplify its own significance as well. And she said to me, from here on out, I will do better. I will do my best to make sure that I am differentiating between what is a deficit and what is simply a difference, because they are not the same thing. And that is really all I ask, because that is a really great place to start. Thank you.
What a powerful piece by O'Quinn, and it gives us so many things to think about. So as we went into that last section, I asked you to just kind of think about and look at the things that we can do as educators. She gave us three very very powerful ideas about how we can actually look into maybe doing something different to change this narrative. First and foremost, we need to look and we need to ask questions of our students. And we need to find out more about the dialectal patterns of the language that our students are speaking, because things work a little bit differently in other languages. There's differences with syntax, there are differences with the way that things are phrased, and different terminologies that are used. So we need to do what we can with our students to make sure that we're asking the right question. And we're not just jumping to conclusions and grading them down for something, but get inside your student's head and figure out what they know and what they understand, not about the language necessarily, but about the content matter that we're teaching. The second thing that O'Quinn points out is that we should seek to learn more. I said in my opening that I am a lifelong learner, and I've heard many educators say that. I think all of us should be lifelong learners. If we truly are lifelong learners, we need to make sure that we are that lead learner in the classroom. We might be the teacher, but we also need to be the lead learner. So when it comes to dialects and it comes to languages, we need to make sure that we are doing everything that we can to learn about the languages that our students are speaking. And a lot of that goes to point number 3 that she brought out, is educate ourselves. Just like the teacher that contacted her, I think it's very important that her daughter's teacher reached out to her to ask more questions and also to share with her her limited knowledge and limited understanding. But what did she do after that? She went to an expert, but she also went to the library and she did her due diligence to try to educate herself on different vernaculars, especially whenever it comes to Ave, so that she could learn what was going on with that. I love how Quinn closes this whole section out with the idea of difference rather than deficit. Instead of looking at our students' language as a deficit, what would change in the work that we do with our students if we looked at their languages as a difference instead? So I just want to push the dial on that and push your thinking on that. That's a good question to reflect on. What would change in the way that you would engage in your practice if you looked at language and you looked at culture, being culturally responsive as an opportunity, as an opportunity rather than a deficit or rather than a challenge?
In
All right, so now that we have gained a deeper understanding of what linguistic bias is, let's talk about what we can do to address it. Now, O'Quinn shared some very helpful ideas about how we can begin that process, and I would really highly encourage you all to go back and watch that YouTube clip of her in its entirety. It's very short, about 13, 14 minutes, but it's so great content. I showed you the beginning and I showed you the end, but I also want you to get an opportunity to look at all that she has to say in the middle. Nonetheless, let's talk about other ways that we can address linguistic bias. When we think about linguistic bias, Drakowitz and Peled in 2024, so not very long ago, they identified some characteristics of linguistic bias, and they're the ones that you see on the screen in front of you. Linguistic bias can be very explicit, so it's there, and ain't no doubt about it. It is there, it is happening, and people are engaging in it. It is very observable acts of discrimination or bias that are being showcased, those unfair treatment for our students. Linguistic bias can also be implicit, where it's not so obvious, but it is still there. So it might be some type of passive aggressive behavior that we are showcasing for our students, or the parents or anybody in that community based upon the language that the students are speaking. So again, maybe we don't necessarily signal these students out, but maybe we don't also work to include them in various groups or activities, if you will. Linguistic bias can be intentional. We know what we're doing and we believe that what we're doing is right. So we do these acts or we engage in these acts just because they feed our beliefs or our ideas about a certain group of people. And also, Linguistic bias can be unintentional. So some of us might have good attitudes and we might have the right and best motives and best intentions for our students, but we can still engage in those acts that that really discriminate against certain groups of students. And whether we intended to do it or didn't intend to do it does not change the fact or negate the fact that it was done, and also that the students were negatively impacted. So this is one very important reason why we have to do everything that we can to work against any displays whatsoever of linguistic bias. Last thing, but certainly not least, I want you to note that even though they have identified these four different characteristics of linguistic bias: explicit, implicit, intentional, and unintentional, please note that there can be overlap with these, and they're not always working a certain way. There can be overlap. They can be just one of these things that is happening, but these are the categories that have been identified. So there are some steps that we can take as we begin to close out, some very tangible steps, and I'm going to give you four that we can intentionally take to negate any instances of linguistic bias with our students. Um, and so they are as follows. So the first step that we need to all be take is that we acknowledge that we all have our biases, whether we want them or not. We all have backgrounds. We all have experiences. We all have different levels of learning and different opportunities that we've had throughout the years to engage with people. Sometimes those opportunities of engagement have not always necessarily been favorable opportunities, and so, inherently, I guess some of us have adopted certain practices or beliefs because of those negative encounters that we have had with certain groups of people. So, nonetheless, we need to acknowledge that there are certain areas of bias that we may or may not hold against certain groups of people based upon their language and other areas as well. But we're talking about linguistic bias today. The next step is to look at and to examine our own personal perception. So, how are we perceiving things? We need to, one, acknowledge that linguistic bias is a thing. So, linguistic bias comes across oftentimes with looking at things through a white gaze. But when we look at our own perceptions, we are taking an internal, introspective view of what might be causing areas of bias in our own personal lives. And what can we do to make shifts in the way that we engage in practices with our students, particularly, but also with their families as well? The other thing that we need to do, and I cannot push this one enough, is to think about names. Just like our languages, we are intimately connected to our names. Names are so important because they showcase our identity, they speak to who we are. So if we don't do anything else, let's make sure that we are engaging with our students. We're looking them in the eye, but we are calling our students by the name that they want to be called. I read something the other day about a little boy who was in school and his name was Miguel. But I don't know if the instructors couldn't pronounce the name Miguel or they just wanted to call him something different, but they called him Michael. They called him Michael. They called him Michael. They called him Michael. And that's not his name. He certainly didn't want to be disrespectful, but one day he decided that he was going to address it with one of the leaders. And he said, "My name is Miguel, and could you please start calling me Miguel?" You know, that almost broke my heart because how would I feel if I were in school all day and as you saw, my name is Jackie or Jacqueline? Either one of those are fine, but I certainly wouldn't want you to call me Janice every single time you look at me, Janice. What do you have for number three? Janice. That's not my name. That's not who I am. So identify your students by name. That shows them that you are including them in the process, that you value them, who they are as a person, you value their identity, you value their culture. Sometimes we have students' names that might be a little bit foreign, if you will, or challenging for us to pronounce. Do any and everything that you can to learn how to pronounce their names correctly. I had a student one time that his name was so challenging to me, and he was trying to let me off the hook because I was fumbling over that name. And I said, no, 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 no. I am going to get this right. So please help me so that I can say your name right. If I'm having trouble rolling the R's or whatever it is that I need to do, help me to develop the skill, because just as important as my name is to me, your name should be that important to you. And then last but certainly not least, let's think about how we are grading our students. Are our grading policies equitable, or are we looking at more so the deficits that we see with those language differences, as opposed to the differences in the language and the structures that the students are more accustomed to using in their native language? So let's really take a close look at our grading policies. It's really not, let's not get so glued and so tied to language structure, but let's attend to the content. What is it that our students truly know? Because that's how they're going to be assessed whenever they leave us in their K-12 instruction. They're not going to be assessed by how they put words together or the structures necessarily, but they're going to be assessed by the quality of their character, and also the quality of their work. So let's kind of attend to that and make sure that our grading policies and practices are really fair and speaking to what we want to make sure that we're attending to. All right, so we started out with these two objectives as we started out this section. I said that we were going to gain a deeper understanding of linguistic bias and the negative impact that it can have on student achievement. So hopefully you were able to see that in the definition that I shared earlier about the unfair treatment of certain groups or certain students. And also, hopefully you gain a deeper understanding, even in O'Quinn's description of how Ave comes into play sometimes in our schools with our students. The second objective that we had was to identify ways to address linguistic bias and discrimination practices and to create a culturally responsive classroom culture. So we talked about some of those steps that we can use to address them, the steps that we just had on that last slide, looking at acknowledgement, looking at grades, looking at names, looking at perceptions. We also highlighted some of those ideas that O'Quinn brought out, like being that lead learner, acknowledging that there is a problem, seeking help for yourself, and not only just seeking help or seeking knowledge for yourself, but also seeking to educate others. Remember how she said that the teacher went to the library and she learned more about Ave? Not only did she learn it for herself, but then she took it back to her students. I love that. All right, friends, we started with a quote. I want to make sure that we end with one as well. The quote that you see on the screen in front of you is from the late, great Roger Bacon, who was a very well-known philosopher and an educator. And he said that knowledge of languages is the doorway to wisdom. Isn't that profound? The more we understand about the ways in which various languages work, the wiser we can all become. There is value in every single language that is spoken here on earth, but it's our job as educators to make sure that we are tapping in and we're doing everything that we can to learn about the languages, particularly that are spoken in the homes of our students. Again, friends, my name is Jackie Morrissey. I am a doctoral student at Liberty University. If you have any additional questions or comments at all, please feel free to email me at jbmorrissey@liberty.edu. Thank you.